All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I'm going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition. I'm going to start this a little bit differently, and that is with an apology, and that is because of the fact that the last lecture took almost a half an hour, and I like to keep these lectures down to about 15 minutes so they're in more bite-sized chunks, so to speak. So I apologize for not taking that original lecture or video and making it into two. All right, so let's talk first about the script manager control. The script manager control, 5 of the common properties are shown on the screen here. We've got async postback timeout, which sets the time in seconds, the default being 90, before an asynchronous postback times out if there's no response. We've got enable page method, where the default is false, which determines if static methods on an ASP.NET page that are marked as web methods can be called from client scripts as though they're part of a service. We've got enable script localization, which defaults to true and determines if the server looks for localized versions of script files and uses them if they exist. We've got is in async postback, which is a Boolean read-only value that is true if the page is currently processing an asynchronous postback, and false if it's not. And load scripts before a UI, the default is true, which determines if scripts are loaded before or after the user interface elements. If they're false, the user interface may load more quickly, but may not be totally functional. So the script elements of a script manager control can contain script reference elements that cause the script manager to load and manage additional scripts. It's kind of a controller. All right, just so you know that. Again, part of the problem, as we talked about before, is if you go in and if you've got, as we've been looking at from Chapter 9 on, if you've got a website that you're creating that's based off of a master page and you decide to put the script manager control in the master page file, then if you want to add additional script managers in the content pages, you can't do it directly. Rather, you have to use the script manager proxy control to extend the capabilities of the script manager control. This is shown here. There's the script manager proxy. Unlike a script manager control, you can have more than one script manager proxy, okay, in or on the same page. So this particular slide is taken from page 817, figure 23.7. There's the ASP.NET or ASPX code for the script manager, and there it is for the proxy control. You can even have a proxy control that registers a service, and they show that right here. All right, and that's how it'll appear on the page. Next, we talk about the update panel control. Remember, the update panel control is like any other panel control. What do I mean? Well, again, if I go back to a more recent example that we looked at in here, and let's say that I go and I'm just going to hit enter a few times. All right, if I come down here and I go to my standard controls, there is a panel. And if I drag that in there, that panel control, its sole purpose is to act as a holder for other controls. In much the same way, if I come in here and I go into my Ajax extensions and I bring in an update panel control, it looks very similar to a panel control. But rather than being a holder for other standard ASP.NET controls, all right, it encloses other server controls that are updated. So the update panel control encloses other server controls that must be updated during an asynchronous postback. So they're grouped together. When controls are added to an update panel, they're automatically made triggers for the panel. What this means is if any of the controls cause an asynchronous postback, the panel is updated. In most cases, that's what you want. The two biggest properties that are used here are children as triggers, which defaults to true, and determines if the controls in a panel trigger the content of the panel to be updated when a control causes a postback. And update mode, where the default is always, and it determines when the content of a panel is updated. When it is set to the default of always, the panel is updated whenever a postback occurs. If it's set to conditional, the panel is updated only when one of its own triggers causes a postback. So again, you can use the triggers element to specify controls that cause the panel to be updated, and that's shown basically in here. So this postback trigger that you see in this example names a control inside of an update panel that causes a full postback to occur rather than an asynchronous or partial page refresh. There are compatibility issues that you can encounter with this, such as the grid view and details view controls can't be used in an update panel if you set their enable sorting and their paging, enable sorting and paging callbacks property to true. Also, a file upload control can only be used as a postback trigger for an update panel. All right. So those are the first two. The third one we talk about here is the timer control. Remember, the timer control, as mentioned on pages 820 and 821 in figure 23.9, that the timer control triggers a periodic asynchronous postback. Please remember the difference between an asynchronous postback and a synchronous postback. With an asynchronous postback, only the part of the page that needs to be refreshed is refreshed. With a synchronous postback, so when the postback type is synchronous, an entire page refresh takes place. So this control is typically placed inside the content template element of an update panel control that's updated when the postback occurs. If it isn't placed inside of an update panel control, it triggers a full postback of the entire page. So in other words, not an asynchronous postback, but rather synchronous postback. So the figure here shows how this works. To start, you can determine how often you want this asynchronous postback to occur. It's measured in milliseconds. In the example here, if you see, it's set up to 10,000 milliseconds, so every 10 seconds. When you set the interval property, you have to be careful not to specify a value that's too small, because if you do, it can cause undue stress on the server. So really, it should be at least 5,000 to 10,000 milliseconds should be the smallest, 5 to 10 seconds. Also, you shouldn't expect the timer to be too accurate. That's because it's controlled by a timing mechanism available to JavaScript in the web browser, and these can be off by anywhere up to several hundred milliseconds. If you need to, you can have more than one timer control on a page. If you do that, in most cases, you'll place these controls in different update panels to have different partial page refreshes or different asynchronous refreshes take place as needed. Although you can use 2 or more timer controls in the same update panel, there's normally not a reason to do that. So the two properties that are used for this are interval, where the default is 60,000 milliseconds or an entire minute, and interval determines how often in milliseconds the control triggers an asynchronous or partial postback. The other property is enabled, which determines whether a postback occurs when the time specified by the interval property elapses. The default is true. You might set it to false if you include more than one timer control in the same panel, but you only want to initiate a single postback at any given time. So here's the code for the update panel. All right, next we have the update progress control. This control displays information to the user, normally in a graphical type of form. You code this within the progress template element of the control as shown here in figure 2310 on page 823. Here the information consists of text, all right, that says updating, please wait, but you can include images or other controls as well. This information is displayed only when the asynchronous postback has taken place. Otherwise, it's hidden. All right. You'll notice here there is a dynamic layout property. If you look where I've got the mouse going back and forth here, that determines how space is allocated for the content of the control. By design, it's allocated only when the content is being displayed. If you don't want that, you can set it from true to false. In some cases, the asynchronous postback happens so quickly that the content appears to flicker on the screen. Well, the idea behind an asynchronous postback with a partial page refresh is that you get rid of this page flickering. So to prevent this from happening, you can set the display after property to determine how long the control should wait. By default, it's half a second. In most cases, again, you'll code the update progress control within an update panel. All right. This has three properties that are associated with it. They are dynamic layout, which defaults to true and determines whether the space for the content is dynamically allocated. If it's false, it's allocated even when it's hidden. The display after, which determines in milliseconds how long after the asynchronous or partial postback is started before the content is displayed. The default is 500 milliseconds or half a second. This value can prevent the flickering from taking place. We've talked about those two already, but the other one we didn't really talk about was the associated update panel ID, which is the ID of the update panel control that this update progress control is associated with. Here's what it looks like. And you'll notice it must contain a progress template, which defines the content of the control. All right, I'm going to stop here, and we will then go over an application that uses ASP.NET AJAX on pages 824 through 833, so about those 10 pages, and that will finish up this chapter. I'll be back with that lecture or video shortly.